The wind had a way of whispering through the empty places of Clara Hayes's ranch, across the cracked corral, over the sagging porch boards, and straight into the bones of the old house. Evening had settled in, bringing with it a low, red sun and a sky powdered with dust. She had just set a kettle on the stove when the sound came 3 firm knocks against the front door. Clara froze, her hand resting on the worn handle of the kettle. She wasn't expecting anyone. Visitors these days were rare. Ever since Thomas died and the cattle thinned out, her life had become small and predictable. Mending, feeding the chickens, tending the garden that barely grew in this stubborn soil. Folks in town called her the Hayes widow, as if that were her first and last name. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped to the door, the wooden floor creaking under her boots. When she pulled it open, the last thing she expected to see was the figure before her. A tall man stood on the porch, his hat pulled low, shadowing eyes the color of storm clouds. His coat was dusty, the kind that had seen more saddle leather than wash water. His boots were scuffed, spurs dulled from years of use. The scent of horse and road dust clung to him like a second skin. "I was told you needed a rancher," he sighed, his voice deep and measured. He tipped his hat with a polite nod. Before Clara could shape an answer, her eyes were drawn past him. There, half hidden behind his legs, stood a little girl, no more than 6 or 7. She wore a faded calico dress 2 sizes too big, sleeves rolled up and hem frayed. In her arms she held a small rag doll, one that looked as if it had been stitched together from scraps of old flour sacks. The girl's eyes, wide, wary, and the pale green of spring leaves flicked up to Clara, then back down to the porch boards. Clara's hand stayed on the doorframe. "And who might you be?" she asked the cowboy. "Luke Mercer," he replied simply. "Been riding for a spell, looking for steady work. Heard through a man in town that you could use help running this place." Her gaze shifted back to the girl. "And this is my daughter, Emily." The answer was given without hesitation, but there was a weight to it, as if it were both truth and shield. Emily shifted her feet, pressing herself closer to his side. Clara's mind raced. It had been nearly a year since she'd thought of hiring anyone. Money was tight, but the ranch had been sliding further into disrepair since Thomas's passing. She could use the help, but a man with a child? That was unexpected. "You'll get your pay honest," Luke continued, sensing her hesitation. "Don't need charity. Just a roof over our heads and a chance to work." The wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter beside the door. Clara's eyes went to the horizon where the sun was sinking and the chill was already seeping into the air. The girl's dress wasn't near enough to keep her warm. She stepped aside. "Come in before the night takes the heat from your bones." Luke led Emily inside, his boots heavy on the porch, his movements careful, as though entering a place that might still turn him away. The warmth of the stove met them in the small parlor, carrying the scent of steeping tea. Emily's eyes wandered, catching on the faded quilt draped over the rocking chair, the shelves lined with jars of preserved peaches, the ticking clock above the mantel. "You can leave your coats there," Clara said, pointing to the rack by the door. Luke removed his, revealing a worn shirt stretched across broad shoulders. He hesitated before taking Emily's thin coat, his hand brushing her hair with an almost protective instinct, Clara noticed. She also noticed how tired he looked, not just road-weary, but the kind of tired that settles deep in a man when he's been carrying more than his share of burdens. "Sit," she said, moving to the stove. "You'll take tea, both of you." Luke nodded, and Emily climbed onto the edge of a chair, legs swinging. For a long moment they didn't speak. Only the sound of the kettle hissing and the faint clink of cups filled the space. Clara felt the quiet present filled with questions she wasn't yet ready to ask. But as she poured the steaming tea and slid a cup toward the girl, Emily's small fingers brushed hers. And in that fleeting contact, Clara felt something shift, just enough to tell her that this knock on her door might change far more than the shape of her days. Asterisk. The tea sat steaming between them, its faint scent of mint filling the room. Emily held her cup in both hands, sipping slowly, as if afraid to waste even a drop. Luke's cup remained untouched for a while, his fingers resting on the handle. His gaze fixed on the dark surface of the drink. Clara studied him from across the table. There was something in his stillness like a man listening for distant hoofbeats. He didn't fidget or glance around the room, but his eyes had the habit of flicking to the windows, measuring the view outside as though the open land might betray him. So, she began, breaking the silence, "How long have you been on the trail?" Luke's jaw tightened slightly before he answered, "A while. We've been moving from job to job. Drifted in from the southern plains last month." "That's a long way," Clara said. "Not many travel with children that far unless there's reason." For the first time, his gaze met hers squarely. There was no anger in it, just a guarded steadiness. "There's reason." Emily set her cup down gently, her eyes darting between them. She looked as though she was listening hard, though Luke didn't elaborate. Clara felt the temptation to press, but something in the man's expression told her that would shut the door tighter, not open it. Instead, she leaned back in her chair. "This place hasn't had a ranch hand in over a year. I can offer a fair wage and a roof in exchange for honest work. But winters here bite hard, and the work isn't easy." Luke gave a faint nod. "Hard work's never been the trouble. Then we'll start in the morning." Clara rose and reached for the kettle to refill the cups. "You and Emily can stay in the loft over the barn until I can ready the spare room." Emily's eyes lit briefly at the mention of a room, but Luke's voice was quiet when he answered, "The loft'll do fine." After supper bread, stew, and canned peaches, Clara fetched a pair of wool blankets for them. The night had fully claimed the land outside, the air cold enough to make the boards creak. Luke stood at the threshold, Emily's small hand wrapped in his. "Thank you," he said simply, with the sincerity of a man unused to asking for help. Clara watched them cross the yard under the pale wash of moonlight. Emily clutched her doll to her chest, her small figure shadowing Luke's stride. Something about the picture struck Clara, how the man's shoulders curved ever so slightly toward the girl, as though shielding her from a world that had already shown its teeth. Back inside, she banked the fire and tried to settle into her evening routine. But the image of the girl lingered. A child shouldn't look so serious, so careful with every step. Later, as she prepared for bed, she thought she heard movement outside, a faint scrape, like boots shifting in the dirt. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and went to the porch. The yard was still except for the barn lantern glowing faintly through the cracks in the boards. The sound had stopped, but Clara stood there a moment longer, eyes scanning the shadowed fence line. The cold nipped at her cheeks, urging her back inside. In the barn loft, Luke lay awake on his bedroll, staring at the rafters. Emily slept beside him, curled up under both blankets. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote yipped, the sound sharp and lonely. Luke's hand rested on the grip of the revolver at his side. He didn't believe in chance, not anymore. And a place like this, quiet and far from town, was the kind of place where a man could disappear, but also the kind where someone might come looking. Morning came with a pale, frosty light spilling across the prairie. Clara was already in the kitchen, the smell of biscuits and coffee curling through the air, when she heard the creak of the barn door. Luke stepped into the yard, his breath visible in the cold, and made straight for the well. He worked the pump with a steady rhythm, filling 2 pails before heading toward the corral. Emily followed a few paces behind him, her bare feet tucked into a pair of worn leather boots that looked borrowed from an older child. She clutched her rag doll, but her eyes wandered toward the chicken coop. the frost-tipped garden, and the sun climbing over the ridge. "Good morning," Clara called from the porch. Emily hesitated, then gave a small nod before slipping back toward her father. Luke didn't waste a moment before setting to work. By the time Clara came outside with the coffee pot, he had already mended a sagging section of fence and was checking the harness on her old bay moray. "You start early," Clara remarked, handing him a tin mug. "Work's best done before the heat comes," Luke said, taking the coffee with a nod of thanks. Clara watched as Emily knelt in the dirt, coaxing one of the hens toward her with a fistful of feed. The child's lips curved into the faintest smile when the bird finally pecked from her palm. It was the first time Clara had seen her look anything but guarded. After breakfast, Luke asked where she wanted him to begin. Clara showed him the warped gate to the south pasture, the leaky trough, and the broken latch on the shed door. He nodded at each, offering no complaint. "You work, I'll keep Emily busy," Clara said. "She can help me with the washing." Luke hesitated, glancing toward his daughter. Emily's eyes found his, searching for permission. He gave a short nod, and Clara felt something pass between them, not words, but a kind of unspoken trust. Fragile as spun glass. Inside, Clara set Emily by the washtub. The girl's hands were small but capable, her motions careful as she scrubbed. Every so often, she glanced toward the window, checking for her father's silhouette in the yard. "You're a good helper," Clara said. Emily shrugged but didn't speak. "Do you like living on a ranch?" Clara asked gently. The girl paused, her little fingers gripping the edge of the washboard. "I like the horses," she said at last, her voice so soft Clara almost missed it. That small offering was enough for now. Clara didn't push. By noon, the gate was fixed, the trough repaired, and Luke had chopped a neat stack of firewood. He washed up at the pump before sitting down to stew and cornbread. "Your girl's got a steady hand with the washing," Clara sighed. Luke glanced at Emily, who was breaking her cornbread into tiny, even pieces. Her mama taught her that. It was the first time he'd mentioned Emily's mother. Clara caught the way his voice dipped, the shadow that crossed his face. Emily's eyes stayed on her plate. After the meal, Luke returned to work, and Emily helped Clara hang laundry in the weak winter sun. The air was crisp, and the sheets snapped in the wind. That's when Clara noticed a dark speck far out along the southern ridge. A rider, moving slow but deliberate. "Do you get many visitors out here?" Emily asked quietly, following Clara's gaze. "Not often," Clara said, watching the figure disappear behind a rise. A prickle crept up her spine. Emily's fingers tightened around the doll's frayed arm. She didn't say anything more, but the look in her eyes told Clara she'd noticed the rider too, and that it wasn't the first time she'd been afraid of strangers on the horizon. The days fell into a rhythm that felt, at times, almost natural. Luke worked from dawn until the last light slipped beyond the hills, mending fence lines, tightening loose roof shingles, clearing out brush that had been choking the pasture. Clara had to admit, the place hadn't looked this cared for in years. Emily followed Clara most days, helping in the kitchen or tending the hens. Though she rarely spoke more than a sentence at a time, she was attentive, her little hands quick to learn. Clara found herself softening toward the girl, noticing small things, how Emily hummed under her breath while sweeping, or how her eyes lit briefly at the sight of a fresh-baked pie cooling on the windowsill. But beneath the new rhythm, a subtle unease lingered. It started with the tracks. One morning, while drawing water from the well, Clara noticed fresh hoof prints in the soft earth beyond the fence, too close to the house to belong to Luke's mar. They circled once, then veered toward the ridge before vanishing into the open land. When she mentioned it, Luke's brow tightened, though he said nothing right away. "Could have been a drifter passing through," he offered, but his eyes flicked Toward Emily before he went back to work. By the week's end, she caught sight of the rider again. Same distance, same slow, deliberate pace. That night, over supper, Clara set her spoon down. "You expecting company?" Luke's gaze lifted, steady but unreadable. "No." Emily stopped eating. Her small shoulders drew in, and she fixed her, eyes on her plate. "I've seen someone riding the ridge twice now," Clara continued. "Not close enough to make out a face." Luke didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Could be nothing. Could be something." Clara arched a brow. "You always speak in riddles, Mr. Mercer." A faint smile tugged at one corner of his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Only when the truth's better kept short." That night, Clara found herself at the window long after she should have been in bed. The moon painted the land in pale silver, the barn's shadow stretching across the yard. Somewhere out beyond the ridge, a lone coyote's howl broke the quiet dot in the loft. Luke sat against the wall, rifle across his knees. Emily slept beside him, wrapped tight in both blankets. His eyes never left the barn door. The frost came heavy that night, coating the window panes in delicate white feathers. Clara woke before dawn, the house still and quiet. She lit the stove, the smell of kindling smoke curling through the kitchen, and poured oats into the pot. Outside, the sky was pale gray, the horizon only just hinting at the sun. She glanced toward the barn. No movement. Luke was usually up before her, already working by the time she had the coffee on. The knock at the door was so soft she almost missed it. When she opened it, Emily stood there, wrapped in a too-big coat, the sleeves hanging past her hands. Her doll dangled from one arm. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and there was a pinched look around her eyes. "Your pa still sleeping?" Clara asked. Emily shook her head. "He went out." Her voice was quiet, but the words carried weight. "Out where?" She hesitated, glancing toward the ridge beyond the pasture. "He said he had to see if they were close." Clara knelt so. She was level with the girl. "Who's they?" Emily's small hands gripped the doll tighter. "The men." Something in the way she said it made Clara's stomach tighten. She kept her voice gentle. "What men, sweetheart?" Emily's gaze dropped to the porch boards. "The ones who want to take me back." The kitchen felt colder when Clara stepped inside with her. She poured the girl a cup of warm milk and set it in front of her. Emily wrapped her hands around it as if it were the only thing keeping her from shivering. "My mama. She worked for a big ranch," Emily began slowly. "It belonged to Mr. Harlan. He had lots of men. They wore guns and laughed too loud." Clara listened, her own hands resting on the table. "When Mama got sick, Papa said we'd leave soon. But she died before we could." Emily's voice grew thinner. "Mr. Harlan said I had to stay. Said I belonged to him now." Clara's chest tightened. "And your papa?" He said no. The girl's green eyes lifted briefly, full of a kind of defiance no child should have to carry. "He put me on his horse and we left in the night. He said we'd keep riding till we found a place where nobody could find us." "And you've been running since?" Emily nodded. "Mr. Harlan's men came after us before. In one town, Papa saw them before they saw us. We left so fast we didn't even get our supper." Clara sat back, the pieces sliding into place. Luke's watchful eyes, his habit of scanning the horizon. The rider on the ridge. Whoever Mr. Harlan was, he wasn't a man who let things go. The door opened then, and Luke stepped in, the cold rushing with him. He looked from Emily to Clara, his jaw tightening. "You been talking?" Emily shrank a little, but Clara answered for her. "She told me enough to understand why you've been looking over your shoulder." Luke's eyes darkened, though not with anger at the girl. "It's not a story I like telling." "Maybe not," Clara said evenly, "but if a man's got riders near my land, it becomes my concern." He stood there a long moment, the frost melting from his coat and dripping onto the floor. Finally, he pulled out a chair and sat. Harlan's rich. Owns half the land south of here. Thinks that means he owns the people on it too. Emily's mama worked his house. When she died, he wanted to keep the girl. I wasn't about to let that happen. And now? Luke's gaze met hers, steady and grim. Now he's making sure. I pay for saying no. The words hung in the air, heavy as the winter sky. Clara felt the unease settle deeper in her bones. She'd thought hiring Luke would mean extra hands and maybe a little company. But it was clear now his past had ridden straight to her doorstep. Emily sipped her milk, her small frame hunched over the cup as if trying to make herself smaller. Clara reached across the table, covering the girl's hand with her own. Whatever. Comey's, she said quietly. You're safe here. Luke's eyes searched hers for a long beat. I'll hold you to that, he said at last, but in his tone Clara heard something else entirely, an unspoken warning that safety, out here, was only as strong as the will to defend it. 2 days later, Clara hitched her old bay mare to the wagon and headed into town. Winter supplies were running low: flour, salt, lamp oil, and she needed to fetch a few bolts of cloth to mend Emily's 2 small dresses. Luke had offered to go, but Clara insisted. She'd been meaning to speak to the storekeeper about ordering. New seed come spring. The road into town was quiet, the wind sweeping across the empty prairie. Still, she caught herself glancing toward the ridges more than once, the memory of that lone rider never far from her mind. The general store smelled of dried tobacco and coffee grounds. Clara was counting out coins for the flour when she caught a low voice from the back of the room. Said he's traveling with a girl, 7, maybe 8. Man's tall, rides a dark roan. Keeps to himself. Clara froze, her fingers tightening around the coins. Another voice answered, rougher. Boss wants 'em both brought in. Says the man's got something that don't belong to him. Like what? Don't matter. Harlan says jump. You ask how high. The man gave a short, humorless laugh. He's paying good money for it. The words hit Clara like a blow. She forced herself to keep her head down, sliding the flour into her basket as if she hadn't heard a thing. Her mind raced. Luke hadn't exaggerated. Harlan wasn't just looking. He was paying men to hunt. She left the store quickly, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. The wagon seemed too far away, the open street too exposed. She felt the eyes of strangers on her as she climbed onto the seat. The ride home was slower, the mare plodding against the cold wind. Clara kept scanning the horizon, but the land stretched empty in every direction. By the time she reached the ranch, Luke was already in the yard, repairing the barn door. His eyes flicked to her face as she climbed down from the wagon, and he knew something had shifted. You saw them, he said. It wasn't a question. I heard them, Clara replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. In town, 2 men talking about you and Emily. They were Harlan's. Luke set down his hammer, the weight of his silence heavier than words. They said he's paying good money, she continued. Didn't care why. Just that you've got something that's his. Luke's jaw tightened. She's not his. She never was. Clara stepped closer. Then we need to be ready. He met her eyes, and for the first time, there was no guarded wall between them, only the raw truth of a man who'd been running too long. Ready for what? He asked. For when they stop circling the ridge, she said, and start riding straight for this house. Luke's gaze shifted toward the open land beyond the fence. Then I'd best make sure they regret crossing it. Emily appeared in the doorway then, her doll clutched to her chest. She looked between them, sensing the weight of the conversation. Clara forced a smile. Though her mind was already turning over what she'd need to do, where she'd hide Emily if it came to it, how she'd keep her promise to protect the girl. The winter air felt sharper that night. And though the land lay silent, Clara knew the stillness wouldn't last. The first sign was the dust dot. It rose on the southern horizon in a faint, curling ribbon, the kind stirred by more than one horse. Luke spotted it before noon, his eyes narrowing against the winter glare. Clara followed his gaze, her stomach sinking. "Many?" she asked. "3, maybe 4, Luke said. Too far to tell for certain. He didn't wait to see if they'd change course. He moved with sharp efficiency, tightening the cinch on his mare, checking the rifle, counting ammunition. Clara watched from the porch, Emily clutching her hand. "They're coming here, aren't they?" The girl whispered. Clara knelt in front of her. "Emily, I need you to listen to me. If I tell you to run to the root cellar, you go and you don't come out until I call for you." Emily's lower lip trembled, but she nodded. Luke stepped up onto the porch. "They're riding hard now. I'll meet them at the gate." "You'll meet them with me," Clara said firmly. His eyes flicked over her, measuring her resolve. "This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the day you knocked on my door," she replied. Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Together, they walked to the fence line, the cold wind cutting at their coats. The riders drew closer, their shapes sharpening. 3 men in dust-stained coats, wide-brimmed hats pulled low, rifles slung across their saddles. The lead rider slowed. As they approached, his grin spreading beneath a thick mustache. "Mercer," he called, voice carrying easily in the still air. "You've saved us some trouble, being right where we expected." Luke's stance was loose but ready. "You can turn around and ride back the way you came." The man laughed, glancing at his companions. "We're here on Harlan's business. That girl you've been hauling around belongs to him." "She belongs to no one," Luke said evenly. The second rider shifted in his saddle. "Boss says she does." "MD. Boss don't take kindly to being told no." Clara stepped forward before Luke could answer. "This is my land, and you're trespassing. You'll turn around now, or I'll have the sheriff hear about it." The lead rider's grin faded, his eyes narrowing. "Lady, the sheriff's already in Harlan's pocket." Luke's voice dropped, quiet but edged like a blade. "You're not taking her." The standoff hung heavy in the cold air. One of the riders spat into the dirt. "We can do this easy, Mercer, or we can do it hard." Luke's hand hovered near his revolver. "Hard's all you're getting." The man's grin returned, sharper this time. "Suit yourself." It happened. Fast. The second rider reached for his rifle. Luke's gun cleared leather before the man could aim, the crack of the shot ringing out across the pasture. The rider's weapon fell from his hands as his horse reared, throwing him into the dirt. Other 2 bolted for cover behind their horses, returning fire. Clara ducked behind the fence post, the splinters biting into her palms. "Go!" Luke shouted to her. "Get Emily inside." Clara ran for the porch, shouting for Emily. The girl darted from the doorway, and Clara grabbed her by the arm, pulling her toward the root cellar. She shoved the door open and pushed Emily inside. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear." Clara slammed the cellar door shut and ran back toward the yard. Luke was still at the fence, firing methodically. One of the riders wheeled his horse and retreated toward the ridge, the other limping back to help his fallen companion. Within moments, the dust cloud was retreating, the sound of pounding hooves fading into the distance. Luke stood still, his breath coming hard in the cold air. Clara joined him, scanning the horizon until the riders vanished completely. "They'll be back," he said at last. "I know," Clara replied. "And next time, we'll be ready." For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind whistled through the bare fence rails, carrying the smell of gunpowder. Somewhere below, in the safety of the root cellar, Emily waited for the call to come out, unaware that the fight for her safety had only just begun. The next morning came with a quiet that felt different, not the uneasy kind Clara had known. For years, but the peaceful sort that makes a person slow down to notice the world. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, painting the table in warm gold. Clara poured coffee into 2 mugs, her hand steady. Outside, she could see Luke saddling his horse, his movements practiced and sure, while little Emma stood nearby, watching him with adoration. For a moment, Clara simply watched them. She realized that somewhere along the weeks and months, the sight of Luke and Emma had become as much a part of her mornings as the smell of fresh bread or the sound of wind in the cottonwoods. Luke stepped inside, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Fence is fixed down by the creek," he said, setting his hat on the table. "Won't give us trouble again." U.S. Clara caught the word and felt the corners of her mouth lift. He wasn't talking like a hired hand anymore. He spoke like a man who belonged here. After breakfast, Clara decided to ride into town for supplies. Luke offered to go with her, and Emma insisted on tagging along. The trip was unremarkable on the surface: barrels of flour, coffee beans, lamp oil, but Clara noticed how people in town looked at them differently now. Once, she'd been the quiet widow who kept her distance. Luke had been the stranger no one fully trusted. But together, with Emma skipping between them, they seemed. Hold out. As they loaded the wagon, old Mrs. Henderson from the general store called out, "Clara Hayes, you've got yourself quite a crew there." Clara smiled, not correcting her. On the ride back, the winter air nipped at their cheeks, but the sun shone bright. Emma sat between them, her small hands in each of theirs. Clara found herself talking about the spring planting, how they'd need to mend more rows for the vegetable patch, maybe even get chickens again. Luke nodded along, offering ideas, asking questions. It was a simple conversation, but it felt like laying bricks for a future. When they reached the ranch, the sky was turning into a masterpiece, streaks of orange, rose, and purple melting into one another. Clara stood by the fence, watching the light dance on the hills. Luke came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "You know," he said quietly, "when I came here that first day, I wasn't sure if we'd last the week. Thought you might send us packing before sundown." Clara laughed softly. "I considered it," she admitted. "But then I saw Emma." She glanced toward the porch, where the little girl was arranging her ragged doll for a tea party on the steps, "and I knew you both were meant to stay." Luke's eyes softened. "Emma hasn't stopped smiling since we came here. You gave her more than a roof, Clara. You gave her a home." Clara turned to him, meeting his gaze. The wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. "And you gave me more than help on the ranch," she said. "You gave me a reason to stop looking backward." For a moment, they just stood there in the glow of the sunset, the silence between them full of things neither had to say out loud. Then Emma's voice carried over the yard. "Papa, Miss Clara. The tea's getting cold." Luke chuckled, tipping his hat toward her. Better not keep the lady waiting. They walked back together, their steps falling in easy rhythm. Clara felt the weight of old grief loosening its grip, replaced by something steady and warm. By the time they reached the porch, the last of the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to prick the sky. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching her doll, Clara sat by the fire with Luke. They talked about small things, fences, weather, the stubborn rooster in the barn, but beneath it was the unspoken truth. This was no longer just her ranch or his refuge. It was theirs. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the coming snow. Inside, 3 hearts beat under the same roof, no longer strangers, no longer alone. And in the quiet, Clara realized something she hadn't felt in years. She was home.